So in today's podcast, I want to welcome Dave Bittner and Ben Yellen from the CyberWire Caveat podcast. And I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. I know Donna gets to talk to you often, and apparently I'm just not good enough to be on the show. So
no, you're not.
We're very selective.
Yeah, I see that. That's okay. That's okay.
Well, as I think you are well aware, Ben and I are founding members of the Donna Grindle fan club. In fact, it's just an oversight that we're not wearing our Donna Grindle t-shirts today.
Yeah, I got your order. I did see the order come through.
Check my mailbox every day. And
thanks for the renewal. You guys are the first renewals that we've had to the Donna Grindle fan club. So thanks for that.
I think every important decision in my life, I reflect for a moment and I wonder, what would Donna do in this case? And that's how I lead my life. But thank you for having us both. As you mentioned, I am the host of several podcasts over on the CyberWire. We have our daily cybersecurity podcast, which is a brief news program that we publish every day. But then also we have some other shows. The show I co-host with Ben, which is called Caveat. That's our law and policy and privacy and surveillance show. There's another program I co-host called Hacking Humans with my colleague Joe Kerrigan. That's about social engineering. And a variety of other things we do over the CyberWire, but those are the main things. Ben, how about you?
So my name is Ben Yellen. My official title, which is kind of a long tongue twister, is the Program Director for Public Policy and External Affairs at the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. I am a lawyer by occupation. And aside from co-hosting Caveat with my partner, Dave Bittner, I also teach law courses at the University of Maryland School of Law, do some consulting work. I've worked on a project with the National Security Agency, setting up a national publicly available curriculum for cybersecurity law and policy issues.
Oh, sweet.
All right. Okay, now I know why I'm not on your podcast.
I will say though, I love that Hacking Humans when I listen to the news and all of that because nerd news, I'm addicted. But the Hacking Humans, when it's like sometimes it's like, wow, that never even occurred to me. But that's what social engineering is all about. Yeah. So we highly recommend that if you're interested in learning some of these things, check out their podcast, which of course is policy. So I was interested. I think I sent an email when I saw the second one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we made the mistake of mentioning something that had to do with HIPAA, and that set off your bat signal.
Yes.
And there was no saying no to having you on our show. So, yeah, and it's turned out great. It's been a real pleasure to have you share your experience.
Yeah, I think her comment to me was, "They need me."
She was right.
You speak the truth.
She was right. Yeah, absolutely.
And I did appreciate on the last episode where Ben said, "No, lawyers don't like reading HIPAA either," and most of them do not. No, but for some reason I'm all in it. But I really, as we get to see more, and like we discussed on the last time I was on with you guys, all of the things that are changing in HIPAA alone is overwhelming to us, but I know the bigger picture's there, and we haven't had time, frankly, between all of the, running our own business, doing the podcast, being on the task group, all of these things, really keeping up with any kind of where we are going. So this is our 300th episode. Still surprised about that. But how things have changed since 2015 when we started this, and where are we going to be? Where do you guys see with you're interviewing, tell them about the different kinds of folks you guys have on and all this different experience that you're seeing, and then y'all roll with it.
Well, we do have a variety of guests on the Caveat podcast, and of course, I get to talk to all sorts of cybersecurity folks over on our CyberWire podcast. So it's an interesting cross section of people that we get to talk to and hear from. in terms of where we're going, I think the two things that stand out to me are ransomware and privacy. And we can dig into those individually. Before we do, why don't I check in with Ben here? Ben, what's on your radar?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take it from the privacy perspective. I think we're starting to see efforts at the state level to legislate data privacy for the first time in a really meaningful way in the United States. So after we had GDPR in Europe, we've now had the California Consumer Protection Act, which just went into effect at the beginning of last year. Virginia just passed a similar law, has some differences, not quite as strong. So we're starting to see how private industry is adopting to this patchwork of data privacy regulations, and whether we're actually going to see action at the federal level, which I'm not a gambling man, but I would never bet on, you always bet on federal inertia if you have to bet on anything at the federal level. So that's really what I'm interested in the next few years is, are we going to actually get statutory protections for data privacy in this country in a meaningful way?
Well, what could I would just want to get your thoughts on, when you look at, okay, just Virginia and California. Okay, they're the same but different. And now I'm a large company and I've got to do both of those plus the smaller ones in New York and Texas has got stuff going on and all of these different ones. Yeah. And so where do you think the tipping point could be on this pressure to build that? To me, I don't see the federal thing happening on its own. I only see the pressure from nationwide companies having to manage all of this. And I know you're on the side of lawyers having more jobs.
Yes.
It's a jobs program for lawyers.
I'm on the side of me making more money, basically. Yeah.
Aren't we all? I mean, not just you.
Yes.
But do you see that? I mean, how can it not start to at some point be a tipping point between these companies that are functioning nationwide? And data is, everything. So it's going to impact us.
I think so. I mean, I think it's become a major compliance problem for big companies because they need to have institutional expertise in 50 separate state legal regimes. Now, for the bigger companies, that's something that's practical. They have large legal departments. They have very smart, staff counsel that can do this work for them. For some of the smaller organizations and smaller companies, that's going to start to become exceedingly difficult. It's easy now, relatively, because it's still a relatively small number of states that have really robust privacy protections, and still only California where you have to worry about a private right of action. So, somebody suing you. But yeah, I mean, we could reach this critical mass of states, maybe, I don't know what the exact number is. It's kind of like herd immunity where everybody talks about it, but you don't know exactly what the threshold is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get to the point where whether it's 10 states, whether it's 15 states, where the industry steps back and says, we can't do this from a compliance perspective. It's making our lives too difficult. We don't necessarily care what the federal government does, but it has to step in. And I think the federal government in the long term will be responsive to those needs. I don't see it happening until we reach that inflection point. But as I was talking about with Dave actually this morning, just because the feds, just if the feds stepped in, it wouldn't necessarily mean more robust data protection. They'd be occupying an area of the law. They would decide to take authority on an issue, data privacy protection, and that could potentially preempt some of the stronger laws at the state level. And then you could kind of get this arms race where states really try and test their mettle in the court system, saying how robust can we make our own protections and still not be preempted by federal law. But again, as you say, we haven't reached that threshold yet. But that's something that I think is 5 to 10 years into the future.
All right. So on our 600th episode, we're going to bring you back.
Yes.
And we're going to say, well, yours crystal ball. Well, they solve that in HIPAA by saying if the state law is more stringent, it takes priority. And the way that the OCR folks I work with, the easiest way to decide is what gives the patient more rights. That's the one, what's going to give them more protections. And I think that the reason we haven't gotten anything passed in the Congress is that one tipping point. As far as I know, that's what everybody argues about the most is, which one's going to take, which one's going to be the big brother on the block. And by the time all of these states get out more stringent ones, we're not going to be in a place where that'll be something they can negotiate any further, I don't think. But
right.
at our world, we just know it's going to get tighter. And we worry about making sure that you can prove it. That's our new motto at Cardin. And a big reason of that is what we're seeing happen in the ransomware world and these layers of extortion that are coming across. I can't even personally say that I can keep up with all the different ways they're planning or offering their affiliates to attack on these ransomware as a service. Is it as bad as it feels like to me?
Yes. The answer is yes. And and in some ways it may be even worse because we don't have reporting requirements, right?
Right.
So if you're a small, a general practitioner or something like that, you get hit with some ransomware. You're not required to report that. So maybe you close the office for a week. We mentioned at the outset that, there are some doctors have chosen to shut down altogether. But most people aren't going to do that. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of reporting requirements may come online. That's something that I know the Biden administration is talking about. I think so. One of the things that I'm really interested in as we look forward to ransomware, and if we track the evolution of ransomware. So we started off with the bad guys coming in and just encrypting your stuff and saying, okay, you want the key, pay us some money. And so people responded to that and they started making robust backups. They started putting their backups offline. They put programs in place so they could restore those backups quickly. And so the baddies responded and said, oh, fine. So before we encrypt your data, we're going to exfiltrate some of your data. We're going to upload it to our own servers. And so if you don't pay us, we're going to start releasing that data. And now you've got a world of hurt from that. And Donna, I would imagine that sets off your HIPAA bat signal as well, right?
Well, in 2016, OCR said they provided guidance that any ransomware attack must be evaluated as a potential data breach. So we've been under that and trying to get people to understand that forever. And now there's proof they're exfiltrating. Yeah, that freaked me right on out the first time I read it. You're right.
Yeah.
I was sitting in the corner sucking my thumb.
So let me float this specter for the group. Here's one that's been talked about, but so far we haven't seen. What if the bad guys come in and they don't necessarily encrypt the data, they don't necessarily take the data elsewhere, they just start changing the data. They start editing it. So that the data is no longer reliable, and when we start talking about medical data, now we're talking about potential loss of life. So to me, that's an untapped area where I hear security folks talking about their concerns for data being changed. And, if you want the log of changes, if you want us to change it back, pay us some money. So I wonder if that may be in our future. They may not have to go there. It may be easy enough to do the things they're doing right now, but that's one that worries me a little bit.
Well, yeah, we're supposed to protect confidentiality, which most people worry about, but also integrity and availability. And yeah, that has me like the most terrified. Now, there are plenty of logs built into a lot of the healthcare systems, but not a big area. Is of great concern is medical devices.
Mhm.
Particularly, you can just watch the TV and see all the devices that are in these rooms today monitoring folks. So you're absolutely right. It is by far the most terrifying thing. But even considering one of the points on the, like, even industrial control systems, we're seeing more. Well, hello, water plant, and a kid from Kansas. What the? But anyway, imagine how freezing cold it is in a surgery bay. And now we've got control of the heat and we turn it up to 100 degrees. And that's now hell for ransom.
Mhm.
I think that it's going to continue to be more scary. And I don't know if you guys, David runs a managed security firm. So he's the guy that we're all going to go, what, David, why didn't you stop him?
Yeah.
And the sheer level of the threats, and with everybody working from home now and all these changes, we have a much wider threat vector. They're coming at you from 10 ways. When you're talking to these cybersecurity folks and they're starting to worry about these things, are they seeing new ways that we can prevent this besides the ones we know, which is managing human and hardening our normal protections?
Yeah. Well, David, I would love to get your take on this as someone who's actually out there doing it. I mean, what I see is a real emphasis on threat hunting, which is, rather than waiting for an alarm to go off, some detection that something has already happened, to have folks, and you either have your own in-house folks or you hire folks to come in to be actively looking around within your network to see what may already be in there lurking, to try to head off that problem before it happens. I mean, David, what's your take on this? You're day to day, how does this rise to your level of concern?
I think that as the technology goes, we have a lot of the technology to either prevent or identify a lot of these things that are happening. But when you start getting into the smaller and medium-sized businesses, and I'm not just talking about healthcare, but just businesses in general, they don't want to invest in those things. They don't see value there. And so we don't have a very good track record of just getting them to do what's already out there and available for them to do to prevent these things from happening. And so that's the biggest challenge is getting them to even take this stuff seriously, because most people run around with the it won't happen to me syndrome. And that's a challenge.
I think at a certain point, we're going to hit critical mass where it has affected every single industry. So whether it's your organization or not, one of your peer organizations has been affected. So for me, I mean, living in the Baltimore region, Baltimore City faced a ransomware attack in 2019, cost the city about $18 million. I think the alleged ransom demand was something like $90,000. So, if you believe that, which you shouldn't, then Baltimore City perhaps made the wrong decision. So, that crippled the city. Water bills didn't go out. They couldn't record real estate transactions. Then I decided to move to Baltimore County, more suburban county. When I got here, the Baltimore County Public School District was the victim of a ransomware attack. And they were all virtual and had to suspend virtual instruction for 2 weeks.
Wow.
So, if it starts to reach the spheres of everyday lives of people who don't know anything about cybersecurity or ransomware, then I think we'll finally start to be addressing this at more of a macro policy level. And maybe I think we're, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, I think we're closer to that point than maybe we'd like to acknowledge.
I think so. And I think another issue here is the whole notion of third-party risk, which has really been brought to the fore thanks to the SolarWinds breach. But I think what we may see, and I don't know if you're seeing this already, David, is that a lot of these even small to medium-sized companies who are suppliers to other companies are seeing their customers come back to them and say, okay, I need you to prove to me what prevention you have in place before we can continue doing business or start our business relationship. I want to see what you have in place because I'm putting the trust of my critical business information in your hands. It's no longer just there's a lot less sort of hand waving and trust us kind of thing. It's okay, fine, I trust you, but prove it.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we're not yet seeing that. Don and I talked years ago about how before you start seeing a lot of people take the initiative to do this, it's either going to have to be the customers or patients that push businesses to do this, or it's going to have to be people that are doing business with those other businesses. Like you said, on the vendor side, from a healthcare perspective, you're supposed to have already been vetting your vendors and documenting that and asking those due diligence questions. But as Donna could tell you, it doesn't happen more often than it does. And it's an educational program that's why we're on episode 300 and we're not going anywhere anytime soon, because just the educational piece of letting people know what they should be doing. And oftentimes they don't know what they don't know. And so that's a huge part of what we're out there doing all day.
Well, and particularly we talk about all the time because I've been vetting vendors for years, and I've sat through so many phone calls of people yelling at me that this is ridiculous, you shouldn't be doing it. And I'm like, if you haven't been doing it yet, you're going to be.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have the CMMC thing coming out for the military, where you have to prove not only you have one, but the maturity model. And so in a lot of ways, there is a question on, do we somehow get to a PCI model where the industries are handling it instead of the feds? And that just gets to data security, not just privacy, because these things, it impacts businesses in a great way. But understanding, and this is the key that we're going to have to get over. We still don't have this nailed down in healthcare, but this is just for your point of reference, particularly you, Ben. David, when we talk about business associate agreements that are supposed to be the bare minimum of the requirements that you document clearly and sign the contract, what do many vendors call that? Paperwork?
Yeah, a lot of people just sign it. They don't even read it. They don't
know
First,
what's
they don't
in
read
it.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've
Checkbox
had
regulatory.
Yeah.
And I've had debates, let's say. I've had debates with some fairly sizable security organizations that are vendors, and getting them to understand what's in their own contract and how some of the things need to be modified to be more realistic. I've had some people that have changed it, and I've had others that, after talking to their team of 5 lawyers, they're like, no, we're not changing this. And I had one, and you can find it in our podcast library, but part of their business associate agreement said, we will notify you of every single ping and security incident that happens in our organization. And so I asked the lawyers, I said, well, how are you going to notify me of this? Because I need to know how I'm going to get all these thousands of messages a day of all these things happening. And they said, we're not going to notify you. Like, but your business associate agreement says you are. Okay, but we're not.
So, yeah. So when we know, we're looking at all of that and what you guys are seeing. So you've got the legal part. Okay, I've got a contract that says we're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Dave's seeing that the stuff's coming at us like crazy. What happens when it blows up? We know what happens when it blows up within our HIPAA world, but what happens in general business where you're not dealing with those legal regulations? What happens today? Are there any protections out there? Are y'all seeing any, hey, you did bad?
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I think it's an important point that I think one of the things that is also driving, let's go ahead and call it reform, when it comes to how people are approaching this stuff are the insurance companies, because they also have
yeah.
their hand in, and they're saying, look, if you want us to insure you, you have to do these things. And more parts of that are cybersecurity and are going to be cybersecurity. I have a friend who's an insurance agent, business to business insurance agent. He was saying that, he likes to use the phrase a wile e. coyote smoking hole in the ground, like what happens, and he'll use that with his clients. He'll say, let's just do a thought experiment. What happens if you come to work one day and where your business used to be, there's a wile e. coyote smoking hole in the ground? What are you going to do? Right. And that sets people's imaginations running. I don't know what happens from a legal point of view. I mean, Ben, what would happen from a legal point of view is, what David was describing there, where in the contract, the client says they're going to do something. They outright say they're not going to. Something bad happens that could have been headed off had they done the thing that they legally agreed to do, but are not doing. Where are we there?
There's a private right of action. You could be sued for breach of contract. Now, of course, those lawsuits really rarely make it through the full legal process. They're almost always settled, just because you'd have to get into the minutia of what a particular provision means, how it was understood by the two parties at the time it was drafted. Maybe it was based on an interpretation that was no longer relevant in light of evolving standards from NIST or somebody else. But yeah, I mean, that's something that can permeate in the world of contract law for sure. Another thing I can see happening over the next several years is little by little, in terms of accountability and having an impact, some of the recommendations of the Solarium Commission might be adopted on kind of an ad hoc basis at both the regulatory level and at the legislative level. One thing Dave and I talked about on our podcast is this idea for a rating system. So for a given organization, like they do at restaurants in New York City, based on your cyber hygiene practices, you get a letter grade that determines the level of risk that you're subjecting to your users. And maybe that's a way of holding organizations themselves accountable, whether that letter grade is simply, something that might hurt their reputation, or if there's a tort case, if there's some sort of liability case, maybe that's evidence that you're not up to industry standards. And there's a bunch of proposed provisions like that in the Solarium Commission that might try to, address that problem you were talking about, Donna, where what does happen, who is held accountable when crisis strikes in this realm?
Well, in healthcare, it's pretty straightforward. The covered entity is ultimately held accountable. And if they've put proper protections in place, and that's why, frankly, we're really excited about the recognized security practices option that rolled out, where we can use NIST cybersecurity framework or the HHS 405D cybersecurity task force HICAP requirements, so that those guidelines.
Please tell me that HICAP isn't spelled with one C and two U's.
There's actually no use.
No use.
It's just H. Oh, interesting.
HICP.
You should have figured out a way to get a U in there, in my opinion.
Yeah. I tried to get them to name it HICP, but they wouldn't.
Yeah. We always have to come up with something. But I personally, this is something that I have always tried to build into things as a consultant, to be able to say, look, this is not just my opinion. I'm using standards. And if you use standards, then you don't have to say that's what Donna said. You say, Donna said, this is the way I do what NIST said, or any of those other things. So I think those standards, and certainly what they're doing with the NIST cybersecurity framework, would help it. Because, twofold, we've got who's responsible, but how does a business prove they are being responsible?
Right.
And that we in healthcare have organizations that go through and charge, a couple $100,000 for you to get certified. particularly like high trust certified.
Mhm.
Well, but the thing is, when you have that, that's a point in time certification. And tomorrow I'm hit by ransomware. So
it's like getting a negative COVID test. You could acquire it in the next 24 hours and that test is no longer relevant. Yep.
Yeah. Or you just acquired it when you were taking the test.
Exactly.
But that's the big thing that we see happening, like the huge Anthem breach that had 80 million patients. They were high trust certified when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting that you brought that up, Ben, because Donna and I actually talked about this in a meeting she and I had not long ago, where it kind of goes back to your comment, Dave, about the insurance, is that we know that we need to prove these things when there's a problem, when there's an investigation, but how do we get proactive in proving it to our customers and proving it to our patients, and obviously proving it to insurance, but proving that we're doing these things proactively and beyond a problem or in front of a problem. And I think that's going to be the next step, but it's going to take something. And Don and I have talked about doing something within what we do to kind of come out with that, as you mentioned, Ben, that grading scale to say, you're doing X, Y, and Z, so you get an A or a level 1 or whatever it happens to be, but something where a customer or a patient can walk in and say, okay, I see that you're taking this seriously. Because the only time we ever hear people take it seriously is when there's a breach. Because everybody says, we take it seriously. We take your privacy seriously.
Yes, your privacy is important to us.
Yeah.
We've all gotten the letters.
Yeah, it's like your phone call is important to us. Please hold for an hour.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, thinking about the rating system, which I think is a good idea, partly because I think a lot of organizations can sort of get caught up in check boxes where they say, well, we've checked all the boxes, we're good here, right? And if you have a rating system in addition to that, think about if you're looking for a hotel, the hotel I'm shopping for when I want to take 2 weeks off and have the vacation of my life is different than the place I need to crash for the night while I'm in the middle of a road trip.
Mhm.
Right. And similarly, I'm just going to make something up here. The security rating of the organization that's going to do my open heart surgery may be a different priority to me than where I'm going to go to get a wart removed. Right. But I should be able to check and see, and hopefully if we have ratings, that the wart removal clinic is gonna up their game, because they'll see their customers fall off if they're not getting good scores.
It's funny that in the healthcare sector, we have those types of quality measurements, in all different sorts of realms, not just in HIPAA compliance, but, like hospital acquired infections. You can look at which hospitals are most prone to their patients having hospital acquired infections. I think that really does offer a lot of promise, is having some standard and then some context. If you know that most organizations are A-rated organizations and you seek to do business with an organization that has a B rating, that really might change your behavior. And I think that's the purpose of it.
Yeah, the hard part's going to be that educational piece to make the public aware of what it is and why it's important.
Yeah. And if you're in an ambulance, you don't get to look up their, like you're on your way to whatever hospital they're taking you to. So there has to be a baseline standard there.
Well, plus you're in a lot of places, there's only one place you can get that wart removed.
Yep.
Right.
And in the healthcare system, particularly, a lot of the changes we're looking at is interoperability, so that we're all connected all the time and your records move around at will. And we'll see that in other industries, that sharing of data about individuals, whether we want it shared or not, is happening.
That's a fascinating point too. And I'm really curious what both you, Donna, and David think about this. I mean, I think about the devices I have in my life now. I have an Apple Watch. I have a connected bathroom scale, that communicates with my phone. So through my watch, through my scale, I have these devices that are logging my personal health information. And I want to do that, and I like it. It works for me. It helps motivate me to keep me in shape. And I like the idea that there's a device on my wrist that if I take a fall or it senses that something's weird with my heart rate, it can ask me if I'm okay. And if I don't respond, call 911. These are all good things, but is my Apple Watch a medical device? And where do we start? If we have this strong desire from the public to embrace these devices and they see them as being a good thing, how do we start bumping up against some of the restrictions that are already in place to say, yeah, but if you want to measure that, and it's not just for entertainment purposes, where do we cross the line there that this is something where no, you actually got to be a doctor to get that information?
Well, that is a huge discussion within the healthcare industry of, a lot of people think everybody's covered by HIPAA, that if you're a doctor, you're covered by HIPAA. That's not true. It's only those that accept payment and process an electronic claim. It's that perception alone is incorrect. And then it goes further to say, well, it's healthcare stuff. So,
there are two things I see on, in the legal community that are invoked more often than necessary. One is the Logan Act about communicating with a foreign adversary. The other is, this is a HIPAA violation. Both of those things are those allegations are true a very small percentage of the time, because as we know, HIPAA applies to covered entities. Most of the hypotheticals that you see are discussing things that are not covered entities. It's just funny how that happens.
Yeah.
Well, and don't forget the business associates.
Right.
And, only one side can, if there's a disclosure, there's only one side that was supposed to not disclose.
Right.
Yeah. There's, just within the business associate and covered entities, there's a lot of impermissible uses and disclosures across organizations where they do share some data, but they shouldn't be looking at other data.
Right.
And we see that often as well.
Yes, I need to know the phone number. Well, here's their entire life history.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a big problem, is limiting the HIPAA specifically asks for the minimum necessary. But on the flip side of that, these new information blocking and interoperability rules say, give us anything we need when we ask for it. So we're headed into, even in healthcare, which has not been good at it, even though they're regulated, which I think we can all agree. We've gotten enough letters.
Yeah.
They haven't been good at it. And now we're going to make it more, in some ways, confusing, but in other ways, more broad as far as the amount of data that we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And it just keeps growing. So what I'm wondering about is, well, and I don't know, Dave, we focus on the ransomware and a lot of the things, if you look at phishing, social engineering, that's the way a lot of ransomware, the ransomware itself isn't launched that way anymore. It's the back door that lets them in, or the theft of the emails so that they can do more backdoors. And, those are 2 of the 5 threats that the 405D program identified. And any business that worried about these 5 threats, not just healthcare, they would be better off. So it's those 2: loss or theft of data, device, insider issues, and connected devices. So we're not doing a good job stopping them with ransomware, but the FBI and folks, they're trying to shut down the gangs, which will slow them down. I don't know that it'll stop them, but it'll slow them down. Are these other vectors going to become less of a problem, or are they going to start shifting over there for a little while and back? I mean, do we see particularly connected devices, just like you talked about? You know, the watch is now a vector into the network. So how are you seeing other cybersecurity folks that you're talking to looking for, you know, the threat hunting is right now, what do I see? But what do they see them doing next? Anybody?
Well, I think there's a big focus on behavioral analysis. In other words, you know, this doctor works these hours from this location doing these things. If all of a sudden we see that doctor doing different things at different times from different locations, the system can first flag that and maybe shut it down depending on what it sees. So we can start to root out some of the anomalies that way. In terms of the connected devices, I think, you know, similarly, if you had a connected device, you know, an infusion pump, let's say, and it's talking to the network of the hospital, and all of a sudden it starts asking questions or reporting things in a way that's outside of the normal range of what it would do.
Or
If we could
tripling the
detect that-
dose of the medication.
Right. It could, if we could check that and shut it down, then there are security benefits there. I mean, one of the things that scares me from, and this particularly comes from the ICS world, you know, the SCADA devices, the folks who are controlling the electrical power plants and water and that sort of thing, is how do you know your sensors are actually telling you the truth, right? I have a sensor out there that's measuring the amount of water flowing through a pipe, and it's sending me data on that. So what if part of what the bad guys do is they go and they take over that sensor and they modify the data that sensor is sending you while they increase or decrease the amount of water flowing through that pipe?
And now extend that to it's a cybernetic device and it's in somebody's body.
It's a pacemaker.
It's a pacemaker. Yeah. That's
Right.
that's what really keeps me up at night, frankly.
Yeah. So
Oh,
the system, the hospital system says, hey, everything's fine. This person's pulse rate is fine. Their oxygen level is fine. No problem. In the meantime, what's really going on in their body is off the charts, but they've taken over the sensing devices. And how do we know what we're being told is actually accurate?
You are absolutely correct. And we have no idea.
Well, I mean, you know, there are people working on these very hard problems.
Yeah.
So, you know, they're recognized and they're out there doing it, but
luckily they're way smarter than us. So
I also think it's worth noting, and I had this message given to me by someone who worked in the automotive side of things, because we were talking about how with connected cars, it's been demonstrated that, you know, bad actors can get in, they can take over a car, they can control things like the steering, like the brakes, all that sort of thing. And he made the point to me, he said, look, most of these very, very few bad people out there are looking to kill anybody. It's not good for business to be out there killing people. They want to make money. So these stories attract our attention because they're very provocative. You know, what all of a sudden your pacemaker goes nuts or your infusion pump goes crazy. Well, yeah, but it's kind of like, you know, a successful parasite doesn't kill the host, right? Because then you'd have no more hosts to feed off of. So I think it's important to keep in mind that while we consider these problems, we not get carried away that there's going to be massive loss of life here.
Right.
Because it's really not in their best interest to go down that path. And not to mention that it attracts law enforcement and you know, in a way that mere financial loss doesn't.
Well, but I also see it as the next level of ransom. We show you that we do have control. Now pay us.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, we wanted you to pay us a little more than that.
Yep.
You know, and we won't tell anybody that we have control of the CEO's pacemaker if you pay us, you know.
Right.
those are the ones that to me are much more, it's the threat of what they can do. But that's, again, what we're talking about. And the more, you're right, the behavioral analytics is absolutely one of the areas that we really, the monitoring to say, why is this person accessing a patient record? One of our buddies that we're due to have on the pod, we need to have him on the pod. He's hysterical, but their company looks at those accesses and looks for those problems of why all of a sudden are you accessing over here? And, you're normally, the process for our patient is this, but now all of a sudden it went down here. And we can do those, and it'd be really impossible to have the processing power to do it in real time. At least not without, like military grade equipment, maybe. But it's, our big concern is small and medium business. That's the market we work in. And all of these really cool things that we talked about, we're still getting some of them thinking, I got an antivirus, I'm good.
Oh yeah. But just getting them to consider risks.
Mhm.
You're doing all these things. Has anybody sat down to consider what risk that new copier has brought to your organization, or even getting rid of equipment? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had people donate equipment and I'll say, did you pull the data? And they're like, no.
Why would I do that? Yeah.
I'm like, are you
Not my
serious?
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so just things like that, where it's just having somebody sit down and say, okay, let's consider the risk of fill in the blank. Just doing that simple exercise is something that's very difficult to even get people to do today. And that's what I'm saying is, even though we have a lot of technology and training and all these things that can help solve these issues, or at least minimize them, that we still have just a problem with the basics, the very basic stuff. And people think what they did 5 years ago is still relevant, and it's not.
Well, it's never worth it financially until it happens. So
Yeah.
most organizations, the Baltimore city government is not going to think it's worth it for them to, hire cybersecurity consultants until after the ransomware attack, when they've lost $18 million.
Yeah. Well, we've even heard
Yeah.
people say, David, we've done business with you for 5 years and there's never been a problem. We don't know why we're paying you. I'm like,
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges with cyber is that, hey, we spent all this money and nothing happened. Good,
That's
good for
great.
us.
Yeah.
There's always money to clean up the mess, but I think part of that is that we've seen, as the cybersecurity side has become more professionalized, is that people are better at telling that story of going to the people who hire them and say, look, here's all the things we blocked this month. Here are all the interesting things that happened on your network. Here are the numbers of what we're actually doing here. And by the way, here are some comparables. Here are some other organizations who are around your size around the country. Here are some of the things they've fallen victim to, this quarter that we've successfully blocked. And I think if we could do better at telling those stories, we'd get better buy-in from the folks who are writing the checks.
I love that. That's like the tip of the day. David, make that happen.
all right. All I heard was you still have to prove it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Prove it. It's
Yeah.
the loop. And I am just flabbergasted sometimes at the lack of concern that people who are running multi-million-dollar businesses have about this. And then we sit down and do just a simple presentation, maybe 6 slides. And I discuss these kinds of things of telling the story. And all of a sudden they're like, holy crap.
This could really happen to us. Yeah.
But I think it's, folks like you guys, and we're certainly doing our part to educate and finding a way to educate consumers, because they're part of the problem. I don't care about my stuff.
Yeah.
It's been
What do I
breached
have
a
to
dozen
hide?
times already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all out there.
Yeah. I'm not interesting.
Yeah. So, any way that we can find to be creative and educate folks, I think is really a huge piece, because I listened to a panel at the recent HIPAA summit of folks that were discussing, some CISOs about ideas of how do we make, and one of them just nailed it and said, look, if everybody had better cyber hygiene, the problems would be dramatically reduced. So it's kind of like wearing a mask and washing your hands with the computer. And we saw how well that went.
The statistics are crystal clear that if you use multi-factor authentication, that is probably the single most important thing you can do to keep people out of your systems. Yes, sometimes it slows things down. Sometimes it can be a pain.
It's annoying. Yep.
It can be, but they're getting much better. They're getting easier. But when you look at the data, the people who track this, Google did a report on this, that if someone is using multi-factor authentication, I think they were tracking Gmail, it keeps them out. It really works. The success rate falls to almost zero if you're successfully implementing it. So it can be a pain, but it's worth it.
Yeah.
It is totally worth it.
Well, we have the 3 rules, Donna's 3 rules of security. Rule number 1, security is not convenient. If it were, you wouldn't have house keys and pins for your bank and all this other stuff. Rule number 2, security is not optional. Can't do that anymore. But rule number 3 is it shouldn't prevent you from effectively doing your job. And in healthcare, that is a huge barrier. And actually, one of the groups we talk about often on the podcast, we love these guys. We use their tools. They're actually up in the Baltimore area. It's Untethered Labs. They run a tool called Gatekeeper. And we keep telling people there are ways, there are affordable ways to be able to get that multi-factor authentication done and stop playing the game. Don't do the SMS though. I saw an article where somebody paid $16 and took over somebody's SMS, recently. So yes, multi-factor, but not with an SMS, not with your text message for those who are like SMS.
Yeah. And there's still bank accounts that do that.
I know. I hate it. It's like, you're going to send me a text, seriously? But I think that in our discussion today, my fellas, I would like to summarize by saying it's an absolute mess. We know that it's not going to get better anytime soon. We know that legislation is going to fly around for another 3 or 4 years before anything settles down to some sort of standard. And we know that education and cyber hygiene are the best way to protect ourselves in the long run. Is that their tips for the day?
I would agree with all that.
It was getting very dark until your last tip, which leaves us with a place of hope. There is something we can do about it.
I was trying to have a little upswing.
Yeah, I like that.
But
Yeah.
and the other piece is, I think that you made a fantastic point there, Dave, that businesses have to do better in being able to prove that they are doing these things, even just to other businesses as well as consumers. As Dave said, that has to happen. And as David pointed out, it's going to be the businesses and the consumers that push it. And I really see that that's the biggest areas is prove it and cyber hygiene, and just accept it's a way of life. It's a factor now.
Yeah.
It's a 2-factor requirement.
We've seen the difference between legislation forcing you to do something and the public forcing you to do something, and the public always wins.
Well, even though if you'd done and this is the thing that we talk about with HIPAA all the time. I've actually had people yell at me, I can't understand why they're making us do this. I was like, well, if you'd done it all along the previous 10 years, this would be just tiny incremental change.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it is the world that we live in, and we appreciate what you guys are doing because you're touching all these other areas that, we're busy enough, and we think we need more, as in the South, more preachers, evangelical cybersecurity nerds.
Oh, I like that as my new title.
It might, yeah, that might work. Although I like the part that you have external affairs in there, and I will be using that somewhere. It will fall into my title at some point, just to be able to say external affairs. But Mr. Sims, you got anything else to add? Because I think we've taken these guys' time long enough.
No, I could talk to these guys all day. So
I know it's been great.
Just have to put the beer down and walk away.
I know.
Well,
Too bad it's early.
Yeah.
We'd been having it. But anything you guys want to add as a parting shot to our listeners?
No, thank you for having us. And we've loved having you on as a guest on our pod, and come back anytime. I think I can speak for Dave when I say that.
Absolutely right. No, we're looking forward to continuing the conversation. So thanks for having us. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you guys. And anytime that you want to hear from us, it's sometimes when you don't, you can count on it.
Yeah. And just as a parting reminder, tell everybody how they can find you and your podcasts.
The easiest way to find all of our stuff is to go to thecyberwire.com. The show that Ben and I do together is called Caveat, and it's a weekly show. We hope you'll check it out.
And good karma to leave a 5-star review. Just saying.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Not a 4.
Yes.
Yeah. We've had one recently that was like, amazing, great podcast, 4 stars. And I'm like, what?
These people just don't get it. Yeah.
Yeah. They don't live in our world of, oh my God, we got a 4 that's going to take 100 5s to fix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So anyway, thanks again for joining us, guys. And we look forward to talking to you again.
Take care.